in America, they have this very large memorial to George Washington. It's called the Masonic National Memorial. And here we see a very large statue of our brother in full Masonic dress. And what happens is thousands and thousands of school children go to this national memorial and they learn about the Masonic origins of the creation of the United States of America. These young children grow up to be adults and they have hopefully an innate understanding and respect for Freemasonry, because at a young age they get exposed to the Masonic origins of America. Is this not what we need here in South Australia?
Brother Doctor, get a partner around the line.
Thank you, Worshipful Master, for the introduction, and thank you for the distinguished guests that we have here today, all of you, and especially I'd like a small or indeed a large hand of applause for our ladies who have come here. It's a great honour to be presenting the results of my PhD to my lodge here at the Earl of Zetland at the Military Club, and the wonderful dinner that we had at the Naval, Air Force and Military Club. Before I do that, I probably should explain to you my Masonic journey. So I was initiated into Lodge Concordia, the German lodge, and it was a wonderful lodge. There were many World War II veterans, so I got on with them very well. And they were an extremely proud lodge with very, very high standards, and I really enjoyed my time with Concordia. I'm also past master of Terra Australis Lodge of the Sovereign Grand Orient of Germany, the dark side, of the adogmatic liberal obedience of the Grand Orient of France. I came back in 2016 and swore my full allegiance back to this jurisdiction. I entered the Mercury Mark in 2019, the KT in the same year, Earl of Zetland in 2021. I was the Deputy Director of the Community Relations Committee, member of the Membership Committee. I'm the local secretary for Quarta Coronati Correspondence Circle in England, the local secretary here. I was a Grand Lodge tour guide for many years, lodge lecturer. I'm the author of the book, The 99 Degrees of Freemasonry, which is an Amazon bestseller. And I've published many articles, including in the Grand Lodge of Victoria magazine, and that one was on Rosalind Chapel and the Apprentice Pillar. So that's my Masonic journey in case any of you are interested. I said Joe helped out. This is what the original letter looked like, 2020. Joe says, "Henning, I give you authority on behalf of our Grand Master to enter the secret archives." And if you're a fan of Indiana Jones, this is the sort of thing that got me very excited. The secret archives in the Mortlock Library. We have a huge depository of books and reference material, hidden away in a special room in the Library of South Australia, and it is quite incredible. You have to have this letter, otherwise you can't get in. You go into a room and it's fully supervised. It's like a prison. There's glass, and there's people with trolleys and lifts, and they come with a little trolley and they say, right, are you, yep, you're Henning Klovekorn, I'd like to see your ID please, and I'd like to see your letter, and there's phone calls, and it's like, this is really serious stuff. And then you suddenly get this amazing relic, the relic that identifies who we are. And here is the relic of all relics. It's the minute book of the Lodge of Friendship, that very first lodge that started it all, which is why we're here. Isn't that incredible? I think it's incredible. And you open to the first page, or whatever it is, the second page, and you see there, 1834, 2 years before the state was founded, they were already plotting to have Freemasonry part of this colony, or in fact, it could be said that they actually commenced the colony. Such is their pedigree and this beautiful handwriting. But what's interesting is over time, the handwriting starts to deteriorate. And I wonder whether that's just a pressure of lodge life, or whether there's a change in secretaries. You can see there things are madly being scribbled out, and I'm so sorry, Worshipful Master, I didn't mean that. It's debaucherous if you look at this page, because you can see there's wine stains. It was obviously not a dry lodge. You can see there's a very controversial page has been ripped out of the Lodge of Friendship record. What was that page? Will we ever find out what happened on that day? So it is an extraordinary thing to look at history like that. What about this one? This is the minute book of Adelaide number 2. Went through a fire, right? And some of these things are very, very fragile. And you have to, I wore white gloves, and it was fantastic to be so close to this. Now my thesis, if you want to read my thesis, you can scan that or type in Henning Klovekorn into Google. It's published online, and I will be publishing a book. I've spoken to the Governor of South Australia, Her Excellency the Honourable Frances Adamson, and she has endorsed for the proceeds of the book to go to St. John. So in the future, all proceeds of that book will go to St. John, which is wonderful. My supervisors were Dr. Stephen Farram and Professor Martin Jarvis in Darwin. The thesis is over 100,000 words. It was in fact 150,000 words, but that's too much. So I was asked to start culling it down a bit. Thank goodness. 9 chapters and over 1,000 direct references. I go through the introduction, the literature review, overview of Freemasonry, which is rather controversial, the colony of South Australia, Freemasonry in the colony, voting practices of Freemasons in the colony, fraternal competitors, key Freemasons of the colony, and Masonic colonial era comparisons, where I also compare our experience in the colony with that of the spread of empire, North American Freemasonry, and German colonialism. This presentation today is not going to cover a whole lot of material that's in the thesis. I'm not going to talk about Freemasonry because I'm assuming most of you have a fairly good grasp of what that is. And I'm not going to talk about the rise of the colony. I'm not going to talk about the key Freemasons of the colony. There's just no time for that. The interaction between Freemasons and Indigenous Australians is also in the thesis. I don't have time to talk about that. The various definitions and models of imperialism and colonialism. In academia, there are hundreds and thousands of PhDs just about models of colonialism. What type of model of colonialism is this and is that? Which is a whole nother presentation. I won't go into the comparative study, but it's very interesting. So when the book comes out, that'll all be in there for you to read. I'm doing the best for St. John. But as a teaser for what I'm not going to talk about, I'm going to share this. Were the Freemasons the largest or the smallest fraternity in the colony? Were they the largest or the smallest fraternity in the colony of South Australia? Hands up if you think we were the largest. Come on, be bold. Of course we're the largest. We're the Freemasons, right? Oh, okay. What about the smallest? Were we the smallest? Okay, most of you think we were the smallest. We were the smallest fraternity in the colony. Isn't that interesting? So I spent months going through all of the archives, and this wouldn't be perfect, okay? It won't be perfect, but it's pretty close. It's 80% there. Now, what is really fascinating is this is from 1888 and 1889. By far the biggest were the Order of Rechabites and the Order of Foresters. They were absolutely huge. We then had the Druids, the Oddfellows, and we were relatively small by the standards of fraternal societies of the day. In 1888, we were only 9% of all of the fraternal activities of the colony in terms of size and numbers. Isn't that interesting? And to be honest, if you would have asked me that, I would have said, of course we were the largest. That's what I would have said. But we weren't. In 1900, that went down to 6%. So as time went on, we got even smaller. Isn't that interesting? I want to share with you something about Indigenous Australians and our settlers, because the media and certain films and books focus on what went wrong, and plenty went wrong. It's only fair that there is so much focus. But you know, when I went through the archives, I found an incredible amount of positive stories about settlers engaging with the Aboriginals here in South Australia in particular, and I want to share just some of them with you, because it's not as well known, I think. Here, during an exploration of the Murray Mouth in 1837, the colonial judge, Captain Blenkinsop, and 2 sailors drowned when their boat capsized, and some local Aboriginal people reportedly rescued several on the boat by swimming to the boat at their own peril. Isn't that a lovely thing to read and to hear, that the Indigenous Australians here went at their own peril to save the colonists? Likewise, here's another interesting example, 1922. John Lewis published a memoir, Fought and Won, in which he describes significant battles between Aboriginal tribes fighting each other. And the role of the colonists was that we were trying to work as mediators to stop the Aboriginal tribes from killing one another. That's an interesting perspective that I hadn't come across before either. And lastly, Robert Guja, the first colonial secretary, he was initiated into the Lodge of Friendship, 1834. And from his diaries, I shared this with you. This is December the 1st, 1836. This is from his diary. I held his diary in my hand. We have long been anxiously expecting a visit from the natives and have been somewhat uneasy at their lengthened absence. Mr. Williams, while out shooting, saw a man and boy making fire, their backs being towards him. He got near to them without their discovering him. When about 20 yards off, he made a noise to attract their notice, not, however, without having previously taken the precaution of putting a bullet into each barrel of his gun. They immediately seized their spears, but as Mr. Williams held up a piece of biscuit to them to show his good humour, burst out laughing, they put down their weapons and approached him. Patting on the back and other cordialities followed, and at length persuaded them to follow him. On reaching his tent, he gave them sugar, biscuit, and tobacco. Being now quite uneasy, brought with them onto us, and having had intimation of their approach, I went to meet them. As soon as they saw me, they laughed and patted me on the back, which ceremony I, of course, returned, but wishing to make them comprehend as completely as possible that we were friendly with all the tribes, I took a stick and, holding it above my head, broke it, saying, "Wambara, Wambara, no good, no good." This is a weapon of war. And he breaks the weapon of war and says, "We want peace here." Upon which the man seemed perfectly delighted and with the greatest earnestness embraced me. Isn't that a wonderful story about the settlers and the colonists and the Indigenous Australians? I was actually blown away by that, and we should teach this story a lot more about the things that went right. So the colony of South Australia. South Australia Association had been formed in 1833 to lobby, of course, the British Empire to allow a colony here. I think all of us would be aware of that. It was heavily influenced by Edward Wakefield's system of colonisation. He was not a Freemason. Its activities led to the passing of the South Australia Act of 1834. The Act required the colony not to be a fiscal burden on the Empire, and required the directors of the company to purchase shares in the company to administer the sale of land in the colony to immigrants. The colony was proclaimed, we should all know this from school, in 1836. the new colony was considered by some as the cradle of progressive, humanist and secular ideals, and South Australia became the first in the world to allow some women the right to both vote and stand for Parliament, and that's by 1894. We should be very proud of that. We were, of course, convict-free, and by 1857 allowed full authority to enact laws by representative government. It provided for adult male suffrage, including Indigenous men, secret ballot voting, no property qualifications for members of its House of Assembly, and it became the safe harbour for many ethnic and religious groups who had experienced, of course, discrimination elsewhere, including, I'm German, so the Germans came here, the Lutherans, the Jews, the Quakers, the Afghan Muslims, Buddhists, etc. We're a very special place, South Australia. The link, the broad link between the colony and Freemasonry, of course, the Lodge of Friendship, which was consecrated in 1834, and it was consecrated at number 7 John Street, Adelphi, the same place, the same room that the South Australian Company was created. Isn't that fascinating? The primary figures of the early colony, of course, included Guja, Morford, Kingston, Finnis. They were all active Freemasons. Guja not so much, but all the others were very active. The first colonial secretary was Guja, first governor Hindmarsh. They were Freemasons. All right, we've got to the bit where we talk about my PhD, Freemasonry in colonial South Australia. In service to the charters of the order and the empire is the title of it, and I examined the contradiction that Freemasonry was perpetuating secular ideals as well as British imperial ideals within the colony of South Australia from those dates, 34 to 1901. So when you start a PhD, you need to do or undertake a literary review. Sorry, English is a second language. And in a doctoral thesis, that constitutes a critical examination of the existing scholarship, mapping the debates, the approaches, the gaps in knowledge, so that you can make, if you like, a business case for your own PhD. And considering the importance and influence of Freemasonry, I'm sure on this one you may agree, you would think it would dominate the academic landscape in the study of imperialism. Surely, because wherever there was empire, there was Freemasonry. But when I undertook the literary review and the critical examination, and I did this specifically of 50 major works, including doctoral thesis and other notable contributions in the field, despite the significance of Freemasonry, the majority of these foundational studies either omitted, overlooked, or failed to address us, Freemasons, in any meaningful way. Isn't that extraordinary? We should all be ashamed or outraged by that. Not ashamed, outraged. So here, without going through all of them, and there's a big list of them, but in academia, some of these books are considered holy edifices of academia. They are the very foundational works of imperialism and colonialism, and yet Freemason coverage, no. Nothing. It's quiet. All of a sudden, it's all very quiet. And having looked at all of these different works, 73% don't mention us at all. I found 20, but they were focused, usually focused works by Freemasons. Okay, so that's the only place where you could find it. Then within areas of people who do mention Freemasonry, we have Jessica Harlan Jacobs and Stephen Bullock and Bob James, and there's a few authors there who do mention it. In academia, there are a couple of PhDs dealing with colonialism that do mention it, but generally speaking, it's quiet on the Western Front. All right. So we know that Anderson in the constitutions, the original constitution, said that we should be good men and true, men of honour and honesty, by whatever denominations or persuasions they may be distinguished. Quite progressive, quite liberal. We have here an excerpt from Brotherly Love, Kenneth Loisel, saying that Freemasonry was a powerful apprenticeship in classical republicanism. Is that what we are, brethren? Do you agree with that quote? We have here Richard Cobb in the French Revolution says, Masonic habits were an integral part of developing revolutionary political culture. Are you all a bunch of revolutionaries? We have our own, he has many, many titles, one of which is Grand Master of the KT, our brother Dr. Richard Nunn, and in one of his publications, Freemasonry in Australia, Dr. Nunn says that concerns in Britain about threats to the established order led to the Unlawful Societies Act of 1799, which again suggests that Freemasons are at the heart of disorder and disruption. We have Stephen Bullock here saying that the constitutions and rituals firmly place the Jewish biblical tradition at the heart of Masonry, suggesting a conservative angle on this occasion. Bob Janes says the prohibitions on lodge discussions of religion or politics within a profoundly religious and politically explicit English Freemasons culture have rendered attempts at internal reform impossible. This is what they are saying about us, brethren. But Jessica Harlan Jacobs, wow, the things that she wrote about us in her book. She said that we have become an unquestioning ally of the British imperial state. Who here is an unquestioning ally of the British imperial state? That Freemasonry was fundamentally imperial in its functions. That's a very strong statement pro-Crown. We were consciously identifying with loyalty to the state. This is a major academic suggesting that we are all monarchists, or were at that point. So, brethren, who are we? Are we revolutionaries, or are we law-abiding monarchists? John, who do you think we are?
Law-abiding monarchists
today. So we have a fun question here. Freemasons, A, dissident Republicans plotting by candlelight? Are we dutiful monarchists raising toasts to the crown? Independent free thinkers just enjoying lodge dinners? The awkward middle child of the empire trying to be both at once? So that is the real question. And all of the above, which is always a good one, depending on what book you read. So the answer is critical for a couple of reasons. Academically, it's a very underexplored subject, as you can see. And we need to move beyond conspiracy theories and replace these with proper academic arguments. Historically, Freemasonry has played an extraordinary role in shaping the culture and politics of this colony and many other colonies, and we must categorise that and the role correctly from a historical point of view. And personally, most importantly for us, this is a chance to reflect on who we are. Who are we, brethren? What are we? It's a very Freudian question. The three main pathways of research. Evidence from the archives, of course, I looked at that. Comparisons to other fraternal orders, voting patterns of Freemasons in the colony. I wanted to make sure that when I was assessing this within the PhD, I wanted to get some hard evidence about who we are. And the best way to do that was to look at voting patterns within Parliament. Okay, so let's have a look at the archives. Some interesting results. The first initiation in Australia was French, not British. The very first Masonic meeting and initiation was in Sydney Harbour in 1802, and it took place aboard a French ship, Le Naturaliste. An English officer, Anthony Kemp, was initiated by a rival French jurisdiction rather than the British one. Ooh, interesting. And Freemasons were tied to the Rum Rebellion, which included Kemp. That same officer later became a key figure in the Rum Rebellion of 1808, which deposed Governor Bligh and created an interim military government. There, sounds very revolutionary to me. Convicts. In 1822, the Grand Lodge of Ireland ruled that reformed convicts in New South Wales could become Freemasons if they were of good character. The Irish, gotta love the Irish. This contradicted the stereotype that Freemasonry was purely elitist and exclusive. Can you imagine that? A reformed convict. At the time, that was a very big deal, particularly in Freemasonry. So we have this idea, were we pro-empire? Well, German Freemasons, they were free to swear loyalty to their sovereign, the German Kaiser, and my thesis talks a lot about Concordia Lodge, the original Concordia Lodge, and the German Freemasons in the state and in the colony. And before anti-German sentiment set in, before World War I, before World War II, the English and the German colonists were the best of friends. They created a German-British hospital here in the colony. When the German Kaiser died, huge hundreds of English Freemasons mourned with the German Freemasons about the death of the German Kaiser. Isn't that fascinating?
Which Kaiser was that?
The German Kaiser.
Yeah.
Now, the first Masonic cornerstone laying, thanks Cooper, ceremony of a church in the colony was not of a Church of England, okay? It was of the Scots Church, and that was in 1844. And this demonstrates that the Freemasons also supported the Church of Scotland, which is independent of the British sovereign. Very interesting. There were diverse views within Masonry. Robert Gouger, the colonial secretary, fought in the wars of independence and for constitutional reform in Spain. Right? So he was very much a revolutionary. Following the victory of the Duke of Wellington at Waterloo, which is mostly a Prussian affair if you know your history, his mother lodge, Trim 494, on its own initiative sought to rename itself after the Duke, to which he replied that any notion his reputation be associated with Freemasonry was ridiculous, and the request was declined. This doesn't sound very pro-Crown to me, that example. The majority of Freemasons leading the colonial expansion in South Australia were in fact considered radicals by contemporary British colonial rulers in Britain, and even the Bishop of London, who supported them, did not wish to be named alongside of them for fear of reputational damage. To circumvent a Republican revolt, the previously discussed British government passed the Unlawful Societies Act. Now, why would you need to do that if Freemasons are loyal to the Crown? Why would you need to create a vehicle in Parliament to monitor the Freemasons? Despite pressure from the Empire, lodges continued to allow members into Freemasonry with rebellious views, which is fascinating. And Masonic lodges in our colony continued to initiate Catholics at a time of continued anti-Catholic sentiment in the Empire. Many of you are very well read and educated, but some of you may not know that to be Catholic in the British Empire at that time was very difficult. There were all sorts of restrictions on Catholics, with whether they could buy and sell certain things, with the type of occupations they could or couldn't be. It was a very tough time to be Catholic in the British Empire at this time. And for Freemasons to allow Catholics to be initiated shows how progressive and liberal we were. Incredibly progressive for the time. Well, what's this? Klovekorn. We don't recognise this. Well, this is the regalia of the Orange Order, and this is the version of their Knights Templar stream. Now, the initiatory charge of Freemasonry contained a universal charge to respect the laws and sovereigns of the member's home country or any country in which the member resided. This is, of course, still the case today. But if we compare that to, say, the Orange Order, a secretive fraternal society which publicly denounced Catholicism, it required members to be loyal to the British monarch and advertised itself as a protector of the Protestant faith. And their ritual, just to compare with somebody else, their ritual stated, "We must resist all attempts to weaken British influence or dismember the British Empire." So there were secret societies in the colony that were very much pro-British. Okay, and we were, well, we haven't figured out yet what we were. And despite such fraternal orders literally copying the symbols of Freemasonry, look closely, the square and compass here. And this is an Orange Order piece of regalia from something called the Royal Black Institution. They're copying our square and compass and G in that particular instance. So we've got these orders and they're copying us and they're strong for empire, but we didn't even take the opportunity to align with them. We're the smallest fraternity in the colony. We could have joined hands with these orders to become even more powerful, but we didn't. Why didn't we? Because we are actually quite a liberal and progressive science. What about the Lodge of Friendship? What about the Lodge of Friendship? If Freemasonry was, as Harlan Jacobs has suggested, imperial in its functions, then one might reasonably expect that the very first lodge in the colony, the exalted, the premier Lodge of Friendship, would be, well-resourced, strongly supported, symbolically positioned at the core of the world's greatest empire. That's what one would reasonably expect. But the opposite, brethren, is the case. The Lodge of Friendship was plagued with instability, lack of members, and lack of financial security. Lodge of Friendship imposed a fine on brethren for non-attendance from 1853 onwards. Why? Because people were not attending the Lodge of Friendship. In 1853, they passed a motion to waive all outstanding debts because people weren't even paying their membership dues. Does this sound familiar? They could not open some meetings in 1856 because there simply weren't enough members present. They merged with the Lodge of Concord in 1869 due to a lack of members. They merged with Albert Lodge in 1869 due to a lack of members. They merged with United Service Lodge 1887 due to a lack of members. They failed to pay rent to the Prince of Wales Hotel, to the Globe Hotel. The Lodge minutes considered closing again in 1869. They couldn't afford the rent at the Freemasons' Hall on Flinders Street, so they moved to the competitor jurisdiction, the Irish Temple, to save money. Isn't that interesting? In 1872. And they met in 16 different locations between 1834 and 1881. So the immense difficulties faced by the Premier Lodge of the colony, its inability to pay dues, its inability to have members even turn up, shows that it was at the mercy of its dwindling membership rather than one spearheading British imperialism. Queen Victoria rejected the invitation to become patron of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite in the United Kingdom, or any of the Grand Lodges of Ireland, Scotland and England, and she instead became patron of the Female Order of Foresters. And the first Grand Lodge to recognise the Grand Lodge of South Australia, and this was very difficult to find because it wasn't in the official history books. I had to write to different Grand Lodges in America. Well, the first Grand Lodge to recognise us was the Grand Lodge of Ohio. And they considered in their proceedings the formation of our Grand Lodge to signify a change of allegiance from Britain. Isn't that interesting? The second was the Grand Lodge of Delaware, which had chartered Hiram's Delaware Regiment in 1780, which was attached to the Continental Army fighting Britain at the time. And the third was the Grand Lodge of Cuba. So that was the archives. I'm now going to go into the voting practices of the Freemasons in the colony of South Australia. So it's a very complicated bit of history about our parliament. I won't go through all of it. But basically we had a legislative council, fully appointed members up until 1850. Up until 1856 it was partially representative and one house. And from 1857 there were two houses of parliament, mostly elected. Right, that's a 30-second overview of how our parliament came to be. And we need to ask ourselves some questions. If the Freemasons of the colony were in league with empire, we would expect a few things. We would expect that voting in parliament would be a unified bloc. We would expect that we would be in appointed positions by the Crown if we're pro-empire, if we're spearheading imperialism. We would expect them to be in the same political party, and we would probably expect them to be rather conservative politically. We might expect the majority of governors to be Freemasons, and I considered the Bill for State Aid to Religion, the Education Act, the South Australian Constitution Act, the Sugar Cultivation Bill, the Workmen's Compensation Act, and a whole bunch of other acts in the thesis, and we'll have a quick look at that. So here is the results of 5 years of study into the parliamentary voting. Between 1843 and 1851, this is now just the makeup of Freemasons in the Parliament. The percentage of Freemasons was 22%. Very high, but certainly not a majority. There we see. And I make the point for those people who love making conspiracy theories about the Freemasons. Forget the Freemasons and your conspiracy theories. Look at the Royal Agricultural Society, because they had an actual ability to change and vote in a way which could have made a difference, because they had the majority in Parliament. 55% of members in Parliament were part of the Agricultural Society. Fascinating. Between 51 and 56, we were 42%. Now that is a very large percentage of Freemasons in Parliament, but still not a majority. And only 50% were appointed positions. 37% were elected, So very high numbers, but we never achieved a majority. That's between 51 and 56. In between 1897 and 1900, we were again 42% of the parliament. And now we come into a time when political parties begin to emerge, because of course political parties weren't around generally during the colonial era. And we see something very interesting emerge when I did the research for this, that 73% of Freemasons remained independent. They did not join political parties. Isn't that interesting? And for those who did join political parties, only 9 were Labour, socialists, and 18 went to the Australasian National League, which obviously is conservative. Okay, what about percentage of colonial governors? 31%. It was actually very difficult even to get the 31%, because a lot of the governors don't say, oh, I'm a Freemason, okay? And I had to go to the Grand Lodge of Scotland and the Grand Lodge of Ireland. I had to, cross-match records and names and dates of birth. Very difficult to do. The percentage of Freemasons in Parliament was very high. For them to be up to 42% in Parliament is significant, but they didn't have a majority. There were other organisations that did. We've gone through that. And they remained independent. And it was relatively low. 9% of the population was in the fraternal space who were Freemasons. Well, how did they vote? The Bill for State Aid to Religion, 1851. This was an attempt to provide direct public funding to Christian denominations in the colony. This was already happening in the United Kingdom. The state was giving money to churches. That's putting it plainly. Okay? Sounds like a pretty good idea. You know, the church is the backbone of colonial society. Well, guess what? 67% of Freemasons voted against that. They were voted for change. Interesting enough also is that 33% of the Freemasons in the chamber wanted to keep things as they were. So essentially they were voting with the Crown, and 67% were voting against the Crown or for change. And so the bill was defeated, and we became the first in the empire not to give money to the churches in our very own colony. Isn't that fascinating? And why may that be the case? Well, when I looked at the denominations, I actually found out that a large percentage of the churches in the colony were dissenting churches who didn't agree with the Church of England, essentially. So the majority of people, and we know this, came here and they were not part of the Church of England, and they were very much disruptors and dissenters, and that's probably why the Freemasons made up such a high majority to get that changed. Well, the Education Bill was an attempt to introduce the cessation of state aid to church schools. Again, in the empire, money was given to church schools. And there were only 2 Freemasons, and they voted for the bill to stop funding church schools. All right, what about the Constitution Bill? Now, this is very complicated, but this is the attempt to introduce self-rule, self-government, 2 houses of parliament, to curtail the absolute authority of the governor. This is us saying we are going to be free from British imperial authority. Well, more or less. And there was only a single clause called Clause C that related to this thesis, and that was the only contested space relating to whether or not the governor could be allowed to appoint 3 non-elected officers into the parliament. This is a way of, come on, let me have just 3 people on my side as governor. Okay, we don't want them all to be elected, just give me the opportunity to have 3 people I appoint, all right? So that you always have the ability to make the vote go your way a little bit, right? Well, this is how it turned out. For Clause C, there was 62% of the Freemasons in this occasion said, yep, it's a good idea. And they were all, and then there were some non-Masons who said it wasn't a good idea, and there were Masons who were against this clause. But essentially, all Freemasons were in the same lodge. They were in the Lodge of Friendship. Some voted for, and some voted against. It suggests freedom of conscience, brethren. Workmen's Compensation Bill. This was to provide greater legal protection and financial compensation for workers injured in the course of their employment, which is of course happens readily. And there was a major point of contention whether to include ships in port or not for this protection. And 67% of Freemasons voted in favour of the inclusion for workers in ships in port to be included for this workers' compensation. This is very progressive thinking for the day. So this is only the tip of the iceberg of the analysis, but the observations are they voted with their own conscience. They were even when they were of the same lodge, they would vote differently. But speaking generally, they were agents of change. Many more examples in the thesis. So I conclude in my thesis, this work demonstrates that Freemasonry was not a united tool of empire-aligned expansionism. The Freemasons of the colony of South Australia and the Northern Territory abided by their own institutional charters and were obliged to religious and political neutrality. The highly universal, tolerant and philosophical rights of Freemasonry were used to define personal moral positions. Freemasonry was neither an unquestioning ally of the British Empire nor a body dedicated to revolutionary ideas, but an organisation based on diverse viewpoints, underpinned by moral codes and common theological archetypes, to bring men of different backgrounds together for the common good. That was my conclusion. Some reflections as I close. Masonic lodges in the colonial period struggled to retain members. If there's a modern Masonic lodge today that feels bad because some people aren't coming along, don't worry. This has been happening for a very long time, okay? It is perhaps part of human nature. So feel less concerned about that. Masonic lodges in the colonial period struggled to conduct ritual. Most of the famous Freemasons that I analysed in my PhD were not famous Freemasons because they were great ritualists. Okay? They were famous Freemasons because they were movers and shakers in the society of the colony. They were building bridges, they were building buildings, they were involved in agriculture and mining. That's why they became famous, not because they're great ritualists. That's not to say great ritualists aren't appreciated or wanted. They are. I'm just making the point that it's not always about that. Masons were largely drawn to lodges for business networks, and it offered security in the colonial frontier. People were after what that special thing it's called brotherhood. And Masons and Masonic lodges in the pre-colonial and colonial period were far less constrained than they are today. And lodges reflected the social and political concerns of their members. They were actively entangled with the issues of the day. Think that so many lodges were involved fighting for British expansionism and imperialism, and we had people in lodges fighting for revolutionary and republican ideals. These brethren were politically active. At the height of Freemasonry, politics played a very important role. And we think this is taboo these days, but it wasn't taboo back then. Masons were exercising their political differences, and this was not frowned upon. And the great example was the Battle of Princeton, 1777. During the American Revolutionary War, George Washington captures the warrant of Unity Lodge of the British Regiment. And among the British wounded was Captain William Leslie, a Freemason, son of an Earl. And Leslie was tenderly cared for and later buried by his American Masonic brethren with full military and Masonic honours. It didn't matter that you were left or right or had different views. We loved and respected Freemasons of all colours and attitudes. The English Unlawful Societies Act of 1799 allowed Freemasonry to continue legally, but under strict conditions of transparency, and it resulted in Freemasonry becoming sanitised. Because your monthly lodge report, secretaries, when you have to, because I've been a secretary in lodge, you have to write down who came and who left and who was initiated and what date, and that all stems from this act, because the Crown wanted to know who is going and joining lodges, because they were afraid that we would usurp the government. That's why we do our lodge report. And Masonry's role evolved from being a potentially disruptive network to being a stabilising, compliant and charitable institution. If I was cheeky, I might say we became a little bit vanilla. The thesis found that Freemasons in South Australia were not predominantly pro-imperial, but acted on personal conscience. However, politically, the defeats of the state aid to religion and education bills, as an example, and the expansion of rights and workers' compensation bill reveal a colonial preference for the independent civic and social policy, with Freemasons supporting reformist outcomes. And the ritual, with its focus on liberty of conscience, equality, non-sectarianism, helped foster a political culture in which many Freemasons supported the defeat of the state aid to religion and education bills, advancing a more independent and reformist direction for the colony. Freemasonic philosophy and teachings were central and likely inspired significant reform within the empire. South Australia, the first colony to reject both state aid to religion and funding for church schools, set important political precedents, and these reforms opened the path, of course, to the public education system we hold so dear today, and they were also likely shaped by Masonic ideals. I think this is a significant part of our state's history, which to this point is largely unknown, and something we should celebrate as South Australians and as Freemasons. This is my last slide. In America, they have this very large memorial to George Washington. It's called the Masonic National Memorial, and here we see a very large statue of our brother in full Masonic dress. And what happens is thousands and thousands of school children go to this national memorial and they learn about the Masonic origins of the creation of the United States of America. These young children grow up to be adults, and they have hopefully an innate understanding and respect for Freemasonry, because at a young age they get exposed to the Masonic origins of America. Is this not what we need here in South Australia? I think there's a great opportunity here, perhaps not for a large statue, or maybe, I don't know, but perhaps in our new, very large skyscraper, we can devote some space there and encourage school children to come and hear some of the things, for example, that I shared with you this evening. Thank you. No.
Under the sea, where the war drums sleep, steel ghosts lie in the ocean deep. He hunts with light, no fear but wonder, bringing truth from the depths of thunder. Dr. Klovekorn, in the dust, in the dark. Dr. Klovekorn leaves a history mark. Dr. Klovekorn, with his crew.